bomb has exploded on board. Bravo. Oscar, Mike, bravo.
The blast kills a passenger and cripples the plane.
I've got two events for you today, as we talk about December 11th, 1994. On the ground, a war began that would affect the region for years. And in the sky, a deadly plan unfolded that had the potential to change air travel forever. December 11th marked the beginning of one of the most brutal and controversial conflicts in modern Russia history, until a couple years ago at least. And that's the First Chechen War. To understand the origins of the First Chechen War, we have to rewind to 1991. The Soviet Union was a global superpower for much of the 20th century, but it was now crumbling. This collapse left behind 15 newly independent nations, as well as several internal conflicts within Russia itself. Chechnya is a small republic with a population of just over 1 million people, and it seized this opportunity to declare independence. The leader of this independence movement was this guy. I have no idea how to pronounce that, but he was a former Soviet Air Force general turned nationalist. This guy became the first president of the self-declared Chechen Republic. For him and his supporters, this was a chance to break free from centuries of Russian dominance. But Moscow saw things differently. Chechnya's independence posed a threat to the integrity of the Russian Federation. Allowing one region to secede could set a precedent, potentially encouraging others to follow suit. Beyond the political implications, Chechnya was also strategically vital. It sat on a key crossroad for oil pipelines, connecting the Caspian Sea to global markets. Losing Chechnya meant losing resources and power, as well as national pride. Initially, the Russian government hesitated to take military action. The country was still suffering from the economic and political issues from the Soviet collapse. Meanwhile, Chechnya was rapidly becoming a rogue state. The region's economy collapsed, crime skyrocketed, and armed militia roamed freely. Kidnapping and smuggling became common, further destabilizing the area. By late 1994, a series of failed attempts to undermine the Chechen regime through covert operations convinced Moscow that a direct military intervention was necessary. And on December 11th, Russian forces launched a full-scale invasion of Chechnya. The Russian military entered the conflict with confidence, expecting a quick victory. Sounds familiar, right? But the Russians underestimated the Chechen people and their intimate knowledge of the mountainous terrain. The first battle took place in Grozny, the capital of Chechnya. What should have been a decisive victory turned into a nightmare for the Russians. Chechen fighters, many of whom were seasoned veterans from the Soviet-Afghan War, used guerrilla tactics to devastating effect. They ambushed Russian tanks in the city's narrow streets, turning Grozny into a death trap. The Russian military's inexperience in urban warfare became embarrassingly obvious. By the end of the battle, thousands of Russian soldiers were dead, and the city of Grozny was in ruins. Civilians suffered most from the violence, though. Many homes and lives were lost. Grozny was later dubbed the most destroyed city on Earth. The war dragged on for nearly 2 years. It's estimated that tens of thousands of civilians died, and over 500,000 people, over half of Chechnya's population, were displaced. Refugee camps sprung up everywhere across the region, filled with people who had lost everything. The international community was largely silent at first, but as reports of atrocities emerged, criticism grew. Both sides were accused of war crimes. Russian forces were implicated in indiscriminate bombings and the use of filtration camps. Meanwhile, Chechen fighters were accused of targeting civilians and engaging in acts of terrorism. For Russia, the war was not only a military and political failure, but also a public relations disaster. By 1996, the war had shifted decisively in the favor of the Chechen people. Despite their smaller numbers, they continued to outmaneuver and demoralize the Russian forces. That year, Chechen fighters launched a surprise attack on Grozny, forcing the Russian army to retreat. In August 1996, a signed agreement brought an uneasy end to the war. It granted de facto independence to Chechnya, although its official status remained unresolved. For Chechnya, this was the hard-won victory. For Russia, it was a humiliating defeat that exposed deep flaws in its military and political systems. The First Chechen War may have ended, but its legacy was far from over. The war left Chechnya devastated and politically unstable, setting the stage for a second and even more brutal conflict in 1999. This time, under the leadership of Vladimir Putin, Russia would take a much harsher approach, aiming to end Chechen resistance once and for all. While war erupted on the ground, something far more insidious was happening in the sky. December 11th, 1994, was a seemingly ordinary day in aviation, but it was anything but. Flight 434, en route from Cebu to Tokyo, was targeted in a deadly bombing that was more than just an isolated attack. This was a trial run for an apocalyptic plot that could have changed the course of history. So what happened, and who was behind the chilling event? The Boeing 737 was cruising smoothly at 33,000 feet. On board were 273 passenger and crew, including a Japanese businessman seated in 26K, a seat that would later become the epicenter of tragedy. Unbeknownst to the crew and passengers, their flight had been compromised during its earlier leg from Manila to Cebu. A man with a Kuwait passport boarded, blending in seamlessly with other passengers. His name was Ramzi Yousef, a name that would soon become infamous worldwide. He carried with him a small bomb, constructed to avoid detection. Yousef wasn't just any terrorist. He was the architect of the 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center. But this wasn't his endgame. Yousef was orchestrating a much larger operation. His goal was to detonate bombs on multiple airlines over the Pacific Ocean, causing mass casualties and global chaos. The Philippine Airlines bombing wasn't the main event. It was just a dry run. Yousef needed to know his bomb designs worked under real-world conditions. On the first leg of the flight, he hid the device under seat 26K, hidden in the lining of a life vest. Then, he disembarked in Cebu, leaving the unsuspecting passengers on the second leg to Tokyo sitting on a ticking time bomb. At 11:43 a.m., as Flight 434 soared in the air, the bomb detonated. The explosion wasn't massive, but it was lethal. The device blew a hole in the floor of the cabin, instantly killing the Japanese businessman, who had the misfortune of being seated directly above it. The blast also injured several nearby passengers and created a terrifying scene in the cabin. Debris flew, smoke filled the air, and oxygen masks deployed as the cabin depressurized. For the crew and passengers, this was a nightmare at 33,000 feet. Despite the damage, the pilots were able to maintain control and began an emergency landing. They managed to land safely, saving the lives of 272 people. While the bombing itself was shocking, the true scale of Yousef's plan was only discovered weeks later, by pure accident. On January 6, 1995, a fire broke out in an apartment in Manila. The blaze was caused by chemicals Yousef and others were using to create more bombs. When police arrived, they stumbled upon laptops, blueprints, and materials that showed the details of a bigger operation. The plan itself was terrifying. Yousef intended to plant bombs on 11 trans-Pacific flights, aiming to kill over 4,000 people. He also plotted to assassinate Pope John Paul II during his visit to Manila. If successful, it would have been one of the deadliest terror campaigns in history. Yousef fled Manila, but was captured a month later in Pakistan. And the airline bombing served as a reminder of what could have been. The incident was a wake-up call for the aviation industry. At the time, airport security systems were not designed to detect small, cleverly concealed items. In the years that followed, airlines and governments around the world started to implement stricter security measures. Many of the policies we're familiar with today can trace their origins back to this event. But the flight of 434 also serves as a grim precursor to the attacks of 9/11, where terrorists would once again exploit gaps in aviation security to devastating effect. And that was 30 years ago, December 11th, 1994. If you found these stories interesting, Make sure you like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below.